we on? Good. Welcome to the Better Than Not podcast. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But when we at least do something, we know it's almost always better than not. Hi there, and welcome to Better Than Not, the podcast that aims to capture shifting perspectives and thought-provoking ideas in conversation while asking the question, is anything what it seems? Based on my series of Changing Frame of Reference, which you can read on the Substack app, and I hope you will, is it might give you some insight into what the podcast is all about. I also hope you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel, Better Than Not, so I can continue to bring you great guests like we have today. I'm your host, Doug Gardam, and today it's again a pleasure, a privilege, in fact, to welcome Pastor April Yamasaki to the podcast. April, how are you?
Very well, thank you, Doug. And I'm excited to be with you today as we have not even met in person, but here we are. Thank you.
It's the power of technology, right? It's one of those things that's a very interesting kind of process that we've been able to uncover really since the pandemic, I think. To properly introduce April, though, April has been a pastor for over 25 years. And as we discussed, she's been back and forth on writing. She's an author and a speaker. She has a brand new book out that's called Hope Beyond Our Sorrows, with a subtitle called Learning to Live with Life-Changing Loss. I'm so interested to talk about this particular book as we kind of go on with it. But she's also, and I'm going to open this up, she's going to be doing a book signing here in Abbotsford April 18th at Coles at the Seven Oaks Center. So after we've had a chat here, you're going to want to go out, get the book, but you're going to want to meet April as well. She still preaches once a month at Valley Crossway Church here in Abbotsford. And with that, April, I'm going to probably go right into the second thing I was going to ask you, and that is, when you have pastored for so many years, how did this kind of writing thing start to stir in your heart, or did it always stir in your heart and you just decided it's time?
My childhood dream was to be a writer. And I remember
Okay.
in grade 3, we were all asked to write this little piece about, what we wanted to be when we grew up. And I wrote about being a writer, and I drew. I wasn't very good as an artist, but I drew a little picture of an old manual typewriter, which is what my parents had at home. So, really that was my childhood dream. And along the way, when I was later in high school, I wanted to be a social worker. I went to university, did my 2 years prerequisite, applied for the School of Social Work, and I had what I thought were good marks and good references and all of that, but I wasn't accepted into the school. So I
Oh,
went on in a different direction with my Bachelor of Art, and I did an internship with a city magazine. It was called The Urban Reader. So I did that, and I rediscovered my childhood love of writing, and I started publishing some small articles, and I knew enough about writing books that before I would write the whole book, I should send out a proposal. So I sent out a proposal, and
oh
it got
yes.
rejected 8 times before I found a publisher willing to take it on. But as I look back at that, I think, I applied for the School of Social Work once, and then I gave up. But with writing, I
It-
persisted 8 times with that one book. And so I think, yeah, maybe that was the enduring dream
well,
in all of that. So it was a surprise to me later on when I was called unexpectedly into pastoral ministry. And later on, a friend said to me, yeah, you wanted to be a social worker, and in a way you are, because in pastoral ministry, you're working with people and you kind of have that part to play as well. So yes, writing was there for me from early on. I thought of myself as a writer. When I was suddenly called to pastoral ministry, I thought, well, it's for a short interim time, maybe pastor writer for a time. And then as I was called to stay on at the church for 25 years and in the same congregation,
oh
I think my
wow.
identity became much more pastor. And then I felt I can only say the nudging of the Spirit because I wrote while I was pastoring. I used my study leave time
Hmm.
for that, and I was still publishing books. And I had been invited to write another book of sermons for CSS Publishing. I'd done a couple of books with them already, and I couldn't fit it in because I was already working on a different book project. I didn't have any more study
Oh,
leave
wow.
time. So I said, I can't do it this time. They came back to me the next year, and I thought, well, maybe this is the time because a few weeks earlier, I had been talking with someone in the hallway at the church, and I had this sudden thought, I'm really going to miss you when I'm gone. And I thought, where
Uh,
where did that come from? I I didn't
mhm.
even know. And it was such a sudden thought, I just kind of put it out of my mind. But then it just seemed, yeah, this is now the time that God is calling me to resign from my full-time ministry here and to pursue writing in a larger way than I was able to while I had those kinds of responsibilities.
So when I look at that a little bit, and I'm going to say, like, you will have an unending source of material for books to go forward with. Because when you mentioned working as a social worker, and this is kind of leads me to, like, um, as a pastor, it's like social work 24/7. Like, it's never ends, I don't think. Like, as I've learned from talking to pastors, it's a very, I'll say, giving life. And how, like, moving from that writing desire as a youth, how did this pastoring kind of fall into, shall we say, your life? Like, it's like there's a pathway there. Social work is, I'll say, for sure a portion of it, but it's only a portion of it. And yet, then all these other things, your writing would obviously enhance that as well. But how did that calling take place into pastoral ministry?
At the time, my husband and I were both teaching at Columbia Bible College. He was there as full-time
Okay.
faculty. He taught biblical studies and Greek, and I was there part-time. I taught the required courses of grammar and English composition, and also one course in Bible. And then I did press releases and the newsletter for the college. So I was still very much immersed in the writing world because that was part time and I could do some of my own writing on the side. And because we had relocated to Abbotsford to teach at the college, we were looking for a church. So we visited
Okay.
churches and with a Mennonite church background because that was part of uh, the support of the college and it was where we had been involved in the Mennonite church already. And we would go to a
Mhm.
church on a Sunday morning and would come away saying, oh, not that one. Oh, not that one.
Okay.
Because we had had a wonderful church experience while we lived in the States for 4 years. And I think we were um, still missing that. And so as we
Mm.
visited, we said, not that one. And then we said, well, we can't just go to a church one time and say, not that one.
Uh,
We need to settle. So we started going to Emmanuel Mennonite Church and we decided that we would transfer our membership there. My husband called the
okay.
church to talk to the pastor about officially transferring our membership. And the secretary said, he doesn't work here anymore. And we thought, what?
Uh-oh.
We just saw him at the church last Sunday. And now he doesn't work there anymore. So we
Oh,
were
wow.
not sure then what was happening at the church. But the church then, as they were dealing with the sudden leaving of their pastor, they started relying more and more on the people in the church to do the work of ministry. So I was invited
Oh,
to
wow.
lead, plan and lead 4 services for Advent. And I had done worship leading in previous churches. I had spoken as a guest at Emmanuel already. So I agreed that I
Okay.
would do that. And after the first Advent service, a woman came up to me and she said, how would you like to be the pastor of this church? And I had that reaction.
Unbelievable.
I just laughed because that was the furthest thing from my mind. And I later
Unbelievable.
discovered she was actually part of the search committee. And over the next number of weeks, as I led those Advent services, more and more people in the church would come to me and say, have you thought of pastoral ministry?
Oh
Well,
my goodness.
finally, the chair of the search committee called me and he said, we've been hearing this from people in the church. We'd like to sit down with you to talk about what might be. And he, at the same time, the search committee was already in serious conversation with someone who they thought would be the pastor. But he said, this is going to take us some time. So we agreed then that the church called me to an interim time. I had the summer and then a leave from Columbia for the fall semester. And we all thought, well,
Okay.
by January, they would have a real pastor. And in the meantime, I would fill in at this point in the church
Uh-oh.
when they were needing some additional help. So we went ahead with that. And as it turned out, by January, the pastor who they thought was going to be able to come, he needed to withdraw. So the church asked if I would be willing to
Oh,
candidate
oh,
for the lead pastor position there.
that's
And
amazing. That's
I
incredible.
I wasn't sure what to do with that. And at the college, I talked with the dean who had been very supportive, and he had said to me, well, do you feel called to pastoral ministry? And when he asked me that, it was just as I was processing this idea of going, interim. And I said to him, I don't think so, but I feel called. I'm beginning to feel called for this specific role in this specific time of a few months. So
Interesting.
now with this, longer term call as a prospect, I really had to pray about that. I consulted with different people on where to go and how to process this. And after I'd accepted, we'd gone through the whole candidating process and everything. Some of the students at the Bible college said to me, "Well, have you talked to Professor so and so?" Because they knew and I knew that he was not in favor of women in pastoral ministry,
Oh,
especially
okay. Yes,
leading
yes.
roles.
Yep.
And I said, no, I haven't talked to him yet. I said, but I will. So I went, and I knew him as another faculty in the college, but I was there part time, so I didn't know him well or anything. But I went to talk with him, and I told him about my experience in the call of the church, and he said, "Well, do you know how I feel about women in pastoral ministry?" And I said, "Yes, I do. That's why I thought I would call and just share this with you myself." And he
Oh,
said,
man.
"Well, if you ever run into difficulty and you want someone to share with and pray with you," he said, "please come and talk with me because I will do that."
Oh my
And
goodness.
that was such a wonderful response. And when I look
Oh, yeah.
today at some of the issues facing the church and how
Oh,
churches
yes.
become quickly polarized around different views, I think back
Yep.
to that, at how gracious that
Oh.
response was, that we might differ on theology
Mhm.
and even on church practice, but at the same time, um, he and I could both respect the call of the church and my response.
Mhm.
So I look back at that as a wonderful, wonderful response, and I'm very glad that I went and talked with him about it.
It's like a clencher. Like, it's like, okay, now it's done in a way. How I mean, that's an amazing story, bro. Like, that to me, like, and it's so interesting how these stories come together because if I'm not mistaken, you're coming back from the US, you're at CBC, and CBC is Columbia Bible College for those listening, not the broadcasting world. And you're not thinking of being a pastor. This is not something in your mind at all, correct?
Well, that's right. And in fact, it had not been in my mind even to teach at the Bible college. I mean, my husband we were living in
Oh, okay.
Virginia, and he was finishing up
Okay.
his
Yeah.
PhD. And so he
Okay.
had come up and he had interviewed and he was called to this full time position. So we knew that. And we got a phone call from the dean while we were still in Virginia. And I said, I'm sorry, Gary's not here, so he's not able to take your call. He said, actually, I'm calling to talk with you. And that's when he invited me to teach
Oh my
English on the strength of my writing and what he knew of that. And I did not have any experience teaching college. I hadn't been
Oh my
trained for
goodness.
that, but I had already at that time been praying because writing is wonderful, but at the same time, I felt I really needed something beyond, my four walls and my computer.
Hmm.
And what would that
Hmm.
look like when we returned to British Columbia? And so when he offered
Yes.
me to teach these courses, I thought, wow, like this is an unexpected answer to prayer.
Well, you mentioned prayer here, and I've had a few pastors on, even recently, with the power of prayer, and it's real, April. Like as you're demonstrating right here. And what's so almost thrilling is how the pathway is opened for you. Like, I just can't get over you're going around trying to find a church, and the church you decide that you want to go to, like it's like the you can't see this ahead. You can only see it backwards to connect the dots. It's
Well,
it's
exactly.
kind
And
of an amazing.
And once I accepted that full-time position, and I had met with a denominational committee and all of that, and they had said, um, because at that time, the Mennonite church had a pretty flat structure, pretty open
Mhm.
structure. And so when I met with them, the conference minister said to me, he said, we would be prepared to ordain you because you've had this year, by that time, a years of ministry in the church. And I said, a year ago, I wasn't even thinking of being a pastor. And so I think that's premature. And
You're
the men-
saying this.
well, yeah, because really, for me, all of this was um, just an awesome journey. I could hardly believe that all of this was happening. But the
Oh, no
Mennonite
kidding.
churches in the Mennonite Church Conference had already been talking in the United States about kind of a 2-year licensing period before ordination. And that was not really part of Mennonite Church BC at the time. But I said, I'm thinking that rather than going for ordination now, it would be better for me to have more time and to
Hmm.
test out this call and think about ordination after a 2-year period of licensing. So that's what we agreed on, and then I was eventually ordained. And at that time, no one knew that I would stay for 25 years in that church.
Oh my, it is it's remarkable to me, but it's like, how do I say, it's one of the themes of the podcast is that like nothing is what it seems, and it's just staggering that you kind of have that kind of like connecting the dots that like we're not in control. Like there's something way beyond us that's making that. And once you become open to it, you can't stop seeing it. It's a stunning thing to me. So, um now you're doing this. So weekly you'll prepare a message in that role, right? So you're able to write already, and you're already taking over classes at CBC, so you're able to speak in front of people. Where did those gifts, like, when did you start to realize you have these gifts? Because, as you know, like, public speaking for most people, especially like at a funeral, most is, if you measured it properly, most would rather be in the coffin than be in delivering the eulogy, so to speak. That's a joke. I'm not very good at delivering it, but and it's like, here you have these gifts already. When did you like discover this ability to, well, you've kind of mentioned the writing, but even to speak and articulate your ideas?
I'm not sure in terms of sort of the more uh, public presentation. I mean, I still write out a full script and I take it with me when I'm speaking. And most who teach public speaking or preaching would say, don't do that. But I do that
So
still
weird,
because
eh?
I didn't know any better. And I'm a writer. And I think I said to you when we were talking about coming on the podcast, I said, yeah, I like to get the questions in advance so I can write out my answers. And a
Yes.
pastor friend of
Oh wow.
mine who's in the Methodist church, he said, like me, he writes a full script, but he said he memorizes it. He leaves his script in his office when he goes to speak at a
Oh,
church. And
wow.
I still like to have my full script with me, even though I am not reading it. And by that time, I know it well enough so that I'm not having to read it off the page. But that's why for me, something like this that's not scripted in the same way is a little
Right.
bit
Yes.
more on, on the edge for me. And yet,
Mm,
really, as you say, it's like a conversation over coffee. So, really, I can do that, and not think of it in terms of, oh, this is going to have a much wider audience. But I remember in university, I was uh, part of Campus Crusade for Christ, as it was called at that time.
okay.
And we had an evening that we were sharing testimonies, and I had shared my testimony. And I remember that one of the leaders came up to me afterward and he said, I don't know whether you will be in social work or what you will do in future, he said, but I hope it includes some public speaking. So
Oh,
I think there
wow.
was something even at that time, that he saw that I didn't
Yeah.
necessarily see. So I think it's
Well,
something I grew into.
well, to me, it's like we've been at church recently. We've been going through spiritual gifts, and um, like those are things that it's just one of those things that you have, and you have like it's not like you did anything. You get better at it, but it's like you just have that ability to do that, and you don't really know where it comes from. And to have something like you just said, have someone come up and bring credibility to you after you just said something out loud is a huge thing to be able to give you a sense of, oh, I could do this, right?
Well, in that time, I never thought of it that way. In fact, I kind of discounted it, because it was based on, one testimony at one meeting with most people who I knew. So it was a very different situation. But the first time I spoke in a Mennonite church, Peace Mennonite Church in Richmond, British Columbia,
Oh, okay.
and the
Yeah, yeah.
pastor there invited me to share a morning message. And like Emmanuel, at Emmanuel I didn't speak every Sunday, even as the lead pastor. It was 2 Sundays a month, and then for
Mm,
preaching, and then 2 Sundays for planning and leading worship, with a lot of space for other speakers, and for dramas and for a youth service, and things like that. So at this Mennonite church, in Richmond. It was the first Mennonite church my husband and I were a part of. And I was a student at Regent College, and
okay.
there was, again, a lot of room for different people to be involved. The pastor invited me to share a morning message, and he said to me, "This is the first time we've had a woman speak at the church." He said,
Oh,
he said, I am not going to say anything about that, because he said it's part of our theology that it's the priesthood of all believers. And so, you can share a message, someone else can share a message, and it's not about being a man or a woman. He said, so I'm not going to introduce it that way or say anything about it. He said, the only advice I would give you is preach it, sister. I thought, preach it, sister. Like, there's an enormous freedom in that. And I'm
oh,
I'm
no
grateful for,
question.
people like him who were early mentors for me.
Well, what I'm finding amazing here, April, is just the number of people that have been able to give you that sense of well-being, like that you can do this encouragement. It's and so quickly. Like, I mean, we've been only talking for a few minutes, and you mentioned at least four, and just like you're over the phone and you're being offered a role to lecture at a college university. Like that's quite remarkable to me.
Well, and by someone who I had never met or talked to before. So I later
Wow.
found out, and maybe this is the other side of it, was that the person who taught English the year before did not want to come back. And I thought, oh,
Okay.
maybe that's a little bit of a warning sign for me. And I did talk with him, and I talked with other people to at the college. So I think I was a little better prepared going into what it meant to teach at that level.
So I mean, you're like with your writing background and like your studies, you're very prepared for this role already from, I'll say, a literature, um, even theological perspective. No, like you're already bringing a lot to the table that um, not necessarily you would have going into a pastoral role.
Well, I had my master's in Christian studies from Regent, and I had done that because of my
Mm,
writing. I wanted to be better prepared in terms of theology and scripture. Even though at the time, I was writing small devotionals, but I just thought I wanted to be better prepared. So I had done that. But being called into pastoral ministry, I thought, well, okay, I have some theological and biblical preparation. I have some
right.
writing experience that I could bring, but I actually had nothing in terms of pastoral care. So my first professional development as a pastor were all focused on pastoral care, how to relate
Mm,
to people with cancer, how do people relate to people who are grieving. And I remember I would go to a funeral of it was maybe an older family member from someone in my church, but I didn't have a lot of experience at funerals either. So I would go and I would also take note about some of those practical things that I would
mm,
need to
mhm,
know, like how do you walk in when you're leading a funeral and where do you stand and are people supposed to stand or not and all of those sort of practical things. So I think I had a
right.
huge learning curve in the beginning.
Wow. No, I'm just like, I'm kind of adding up spiritual gifts here that you have. Like, I just think it's kind of fascinating to see that. So I'm going to step back a little bit now because you mentioned in your youth, you really like to write. Were you also a big reader?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I would go to the public library and, bring stacks of books home. And my both of my parents, although they did not have a lot of formal education, they were also readers as a family. We
Oh,
subscribed to
okay.
both the Province and the Vancouver Sun newspaper. In those days, it was one in the was a morning paper, and then the other was an afternoon paper. So I would read that as well. So I did have a good grounding in reading.
What were some of your early, like, would you say, influences of those authors that you like to read?
One writer I think who has been enduring for me is that as a child, I read C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and
Oh
the
yeah.
Wardrobe, and sort of that series of fantasy books. And so I loved those. And later on, as I was doing some more serious reading and theology and so on, I read some of C.S. Lewis's book. And then when my husband died in 2022, the women of my Writers Guild sent me a beautiful care package. And so there was a book for coloring and some beautiful markers to color. Um, and they also sent in that package C.S. Lewis, A Grief Observed, that he had
Oh
written
no.
after the death
Oh
of his
yes.
wife. And that
Oh
was
my
one book of
goodness.
his that even though I had read C.S. Lewis throughout my life, sort of, I hadn't read that one. It took me a few months before I felt like I could read it, but I read his book, and as I read, part of me said, "Yeah, that's also how I feel," and part of me I thought, "No, no, that is not at all my experience." And after
Mm,
I finished reading it, I thought, really, I think everyone could write their own story of
mm,
grief because it is very personal and how we walk through that time. So that
yes.
also became a foundational book for me as I later went on to write my own story of grief.
Well, you bring up C.S. Lewis, and it comes up over and over again because I want to get to that. Like, sounds like it helped inspire some of your own books. But for C.S. Lewis, for me, was a I never read him like the Narnia series as you started with. And I think one of the first books of his that I was introduced to, and later in life, was Screw Tape Letters. And I have to be honest, April, that has become one of my favorite books just because of I don't even know how to necessarily capture it, but it's it's written. Have you read Screw Tape Letters?
I have read it, and my husband would say that would be his favorite C.S. Lewis book as well.
I find it stunning that what he was able to accomplish in that book. And I can see why many didn't like it because when you're reading it and you start agreeing with it, because I've spoken about this book on the podcast before because it's written from the demon perspective. And so you're reading this and you're agreeing with it and you're going, "Oh, that's wrong." And you get tricked like over and over again. And yet, when you read it carefully, it's very much and very clear what's happening. And so that's kind of pushed me on to Mere Christianity. But when you speak about C.S. Lewis on grief, um, I find it because he wrote two books on this. One was the intellectual on pain and suffering, and then when Joy passed, he wrote it real, and they're very different. And I found it kind of fascinating how that we can we can write about things from an outside world, so to speak, in an intellectual sense. But when we're in it, it's a very different perspective. And to me, it's such an interesting contrast, especially when you're dealing with so many different people. When you're in the lows of life, it's so hard to see temporary. And it's so hard to see the other side. Likewise, when you're in the happy sides of things, it's like, how could I ever have been that sad? And when he captured those two things in those books, I found it so interesting. And this is why I'd like to know how you reflected it, having gone through the experience personally yourself. And as pastoral work, you're kind of constantly kind of in that world. How did you did that help you? Did that see you? Does it help to explain that before we get into your books?
One of the questions I was asked by a colleague, he said to me, this was after my husband had passed away, and he said, you've walked with a lot of people through grief, and now that you've had this experience yourself, he said, what most
Mm.
surprised you? And I paused for a long time thinking about that question, and I said to him, everything. It just seems to me like everything has changed. And I think it is one thing, as you say, in C.S. Lewis, in his writing, where he looks at it more from the outside about theology and the teaching of scripture and how are we to understand these big questions of suffering and grief, and then to look at it from the more personal side of what did he really experience at that time more personally. And I think there's value in both approaches. And so for me, yeah, it was like walking with people. I knew it from one side, and then my own experience, I knew it from a different side. And my my in-laws and my parents had already died previously, and I would say walking through those experiences too, they were different personally than walking with alongside someone who was going through that themselves.
Interesting. So, what what prompted you to begin writing about that? Or had you done it in different ways all along the way in your books?
I've been a journaler, someone who keeps a journal lifelong. So,
Mm.
started as a young adult, and I would journal some of my experience. So I did that even while my husband was unwell and in the hospital and so on. But I never thought, in spite of my thinking, oh, everyone could write their own story of grief. I never really thought of that for myself. But a new editor at Herald Press sent me an email it was the 10th anniversary of Sacred Pauses, which was my first Herald Press book. So
Hmm.
she emailed and said, I want to congratulate you on 10 years of Sacred Pauses. And it's still in print, it's still being used in
Amazing,
schools
amazing.
and colleges and so on spiritual practices. And she said, we're also wondering if you might be ready to write another book for us. And she had two ideas. She said, maybe a book on grief, because she had read some of my blog posts. Hadn't written a lot, but
Mm.
I'd written some blog posts on that. And the other one is on pastoral burnout, because she had heard me speak on that.
Mm.
And I said to her, I when I think of those two topics, really they're both grief experiences. Because
Mhm,
when you
mhm.
lose a loved one in death, that is a grief experience. And when you are burned out and you maybe lose your job or lose your church or lose your health through it, that is also a grief experience. And I said, let me think about that, um, because I would be more inclined to write on sort of the recovery phase, not so much of what it's like uh, deep in it when things are happening. And it was another, I would say, God moment, because a few weeks before that, when my husband first died, it was sudden, and I
Oh,
had a
okay.
book contract at that time, but I wasn't sure if I could finish it, and I wasn't sure about writing. But a few weeks before I received her email, I had a sudden thought, maybe I'm ready to think about writing a book. And again, I don't know really where that thought came from. And in fact, it was so
Mhm.
fleeting that when a writer friend asked me if I was writing another book, I said, well, no, I'm not writing another book. And at the time, I was just maybe thinking about writing a book. But, you know, again, this was a sudden request coming from my publisher. And I thought, well, I'll think about that. And Herald Press, like a lot of publishers, has a proposal outline. They had 12
Mhm.
questions. So she sent me the 12 questions. And it actually took me about half a year to fill that out and to send it back. And then she said,
Oh,
well,
so
this is,
that's
this
well
is,
thought out. Oh
oh, well,
my.
I just thought I can't think about that. And then I could think about that. So I finally finished it, sent it in. And she said, well, and now we need a sample chapter before I would talk with our committee about scheduling a date. So it took me another half year to write that. So I would say, yeah, I probably wasn't ready to write it when she asked me,
Mhm.
but I became ready over that year. And then once I actually signed a contract, typically for them, once an author signs a contract, then the due date is another 6 months. And I signed that
Mm.
contract, but I said to myself, it took you half a year to do the outline with the proposal, half a year to write the first chapter. Now you're going to write the rest of the book in 6 months. That just seemed impossible. And yet,
Right.
I had written in my journal so I could draw on that. I had written some blog posts so I could draw on that. And over the time, that year of developing things, even though I wasn't writing, I was thinking about that. And so I did finish it in another 6 months. And
Oh, you
it
did?
goes through,
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
it goes through developmental editing on their side. So they have
Mhm.
a editor who looks at the whole thing and then makes suggestions for different changes. And I thought that developmental edit takes 3 weeks. That's also the time I can relook at my own manuscript, and I'll add any of my other changes when I add the developmental edit. So I said, okay, it doesn't have to be perfect, but just get it done by the deadline, send it in, and continue to refine it. And so that's what I did. And after developmental editing, then they go through copy editing, and then so it's a
Yes.
process on the publisher
Yeah.
side.
Merit very much. So, is this what became Hope Beyond our sorrows?
Yes, it became Hope Beyond Our Sorrows, and that title comes from a hymn where that's one of the lines. And I loved that hymn, and I thought that would be a beautiful title for this book. And uh, with Herald Press, they go through a process even on titles. And with my other two
Oh,
books, the title I submitted was not the title that became the book, but
that
in this case it was. So I'm grateful for that.
oh, that's very cool. So is that book? I meant to check this before I talked with you, but is that book out now?
Yes, it was actually
Okay,
released in June officially.
okay,
I say
okay, okay.
officially because what happened was that all of the books that were shipped from the printer to the publisher, they all got lost. That has never happened before for this publisher. They said,
No
sometimes a
way.
carton or two might go missing, but not the whole shipment. So it actually, I had my books for my
Wow.
launch here in Abbotsford in June when it was supposed to be released. But in terms of getting to the stores and to Amazon, it didn't happen until July because those books had to be reprinted. And they never did find them. Both the printer and the carrier, the shipper,
That's amazing.
they actually had insurance claims on it because they were just lost.
Wow. Like that sounds like something that would have happened over the pandemic, not like last year. Like wow.
Yes, exactly. Well, and never in the history of that they can remember of this publisher. So we don't know what happened, but definitely a little bump along the way.
So it, so going through all these different processes, it's like it's a lot of work, right? And you get a lot of, I'll say, so we say positive, good, like just feedback and going through that. Did from what you like the kernel from which you started with, were you kind of like amazed at what it ended up in this particular book?
I would say the developmental and copy editing were wonderful in improving the manuscript, but what they did was they helped refine it and make it better, but it was all still as I
What you
envisioned,
started
as
with?
I wrote. Yeah,
Ah,
and I
that's
had
cool.
read about different stages of grief, and as I thought about those, I thought, yeah, they all have something to offer, and people might say 5 stages or 7 stages or 3 stages, but for me, and I'm writing more from my experience, not so much a
Hmm.
theological piece. I thought really there were 3 stages of grief. It was early grief, um, where I felt I could hardly move. Sometimes I felt I could hardly breathe. It was like a sudden plunge into molasses, which I had read some people who compared grief to molasses. I thought, yeah, that's my experience.
Interesting.
Sudden death, sudden plunge into molasses, that's early grief. And then middle grief is the struggle to get out of that molasses. So all the firsts, um,
Mm.
the first anniversary, the first birthday, the first Christmas, all of those first, part of that middle grief. And then I thought, yeah, then the third stage is present grief. Just like molasses clings, grief clings to
Yeah,
us
yeah.
even as we move forward. So that's how I thought of grief. And so I wrote the book with those 3 stages in mind. That became the framework.
Interesting. Well, it in going through this with you, April, and I appreciate the sharing because I'm sure that that's not easy. I'm in a different situation because I have not experienced this, and so having read some of the C.S. Lewis work on it, and sometimes I find that it's very strange because like I've had to deal, and it's not the same, but it's had to deal with pets, but I've not lost, believe it or not, anyone close to me in my life. And it's like, and what I mean by I've lifelong grandparents, but I wasn't really close to them in the sense of like a dear friend or a spouse or something like that. So for me, hearing this, it's always very kind of the C.S. Lewis intellectual picture. And I'm always intrigued because it's like, how will this happen? Like how will that take place for me? And when you said a very interesting point, and I think it's important that makes us human, is everyone kind of experiences this in a different way. You found.
Yes, I think so. Some talk about parallel experience. So someone else who has also had the death of a spouse, that might be a parallel experience to what I experienced, but it's not the same experience
Hmm.
because we are so different from one another. Um, and yet there are commonalities in grief. I received an email from someone who said, her experience is very different. Her husband is ill, and so she's a full-time caregiver for him. So it's a different kind of grief. Yet she said,
Hmm.
I really resonate with what you talk about in this book. So I'm glad that there is a connection more broadly with different kinds of grief. And I actually do mention grief over pets in my book as well, because for some people, their pet is a member of their family, a beloved member of their family. And so that is also something to respect the grieving that comes along with that.
Well, when you mention that, and it's something that's in our psyche, and I'm not comparing this in any way, but it makes me think of the when we put this on, I'll call it not just on living things, but the movie Castaway. I don't know whether you're familiar with that movie, but he's alone for so long, he begins to see his what do you call it, Wilson, the ball volleyball that was with him, and even that sense becomes very large in his life, right? When that object leaves, and it affects that. There's a grieving part that's very much very real. And so I'm intrigued because like I can't write the other book yet, if you understand what I mean.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Well, and that, that's a blessing that you haven't had to go through that, and you've had many other experiences which have
Mhm.
enriched your life and brought spiritual growth. And I would say, grieving is one of those. And when I think back to my pastoral experience, when I
Yes.
started as an interim time, there was a member of the church, a former missionary, who was already ill with cancer. And I remember praying, God, do not let him die when I am in this role. I'm only here for a short time, and
Hmm.
I will not know what to do or what to say. So I knew that about myself, but what a
Yeah.
prayer. I mean, in some ways, a very selfish prayer, right? Um, but
Yeah. Well.
then he did die, and his wife called me, and he died at home. His body was still there, and she called me, and so I drove over there. And as I was driving, I thought to myself, what a grace from God that he's died, but we had a chance to have a relationship over these
Hmm.
last months. And so even though I said, I still don't know what I'm going to say or what I'm supposed to do, but I wasn't so fearful about that because
Ah,
we
okay.
had grown to know one another. Um, and so it was different. And I was amazed at God's grace, even as I entered ministry without being as prepared as I would have liked to have been. And yet at the same time, God had given us that time together first. So I'm grateful for that.
Well, it's very interesting to me. I had a gentleman on the podcast a while back. His name was Tom Layton. He's a author of a book called Eyes of the Father, and they lost his wife and him lost their 13-year-old son. And I was introduced via another way to it, but he had this ability to articulate the emotional um, part of going through this with this young son. And what I found amazing, April, and this is kind of where my next question kind of goes to, is I called it the epitome of faith because faith brought him and his wife together even closer over this. And it was such a stunning thing to me that I found like the aspects and the magnificence of faith in believing and how that helps you through. Because I mean, Paul talks a lot about suffering. We I mean, obviously Christ just suffered enormously for us, and yet when you go through it, it's a different thing. And how because I mean, as a pastor, um, as I mentioned before, you're dealing with pastoral needs of the congregation constantly. How did that, like, how did that faith, what was that experience like for you? If you can share that without giving your book away, so to speak.
There have been so many losses over the years as I think back to my time as a pastor and walking with people in very different ways. And because I knew as I entered into pastoral ministry, I was coming without good foundational training, but I was trying to get that as I walked along. But for me, it became very important just to listen to God and to listen to the people, what they
Mm.
were going through and what did they need. And so that was my guiding principle. And I think even now, sometimes people will ask, well, how do we respond to someone who is grieving? You know, my friend who has lost a spouse, or my family member who has lost a dear friend. You know, how do we help support those who are grieving? And I would say everyone's experience is different. And some people really want to have a house full of people all the time. That helps them to grieve. And some people just want to curl up on their own and have a good cry. And that's what helps them to grieve. And sometimes the same person will want one or the other. And I know for myself, sometimes I didn't know what I wanted. So
Right.
I think to um, be aware of that and to know that one thing, it's not one size fits all in terms of the practical things. What do I do or what do I say? But I
Mhm.
think always to listen to God, listen to the person. For those that you know well already, you probably have some good clues as to what would be most appropriate for them.
Interesting. No, because it, to me, it's a beautiful thing. Those that have, I'll call it that gift to be able to be empathetic to those really tough situations, and and a shoulder to lean on with the sense that, like, God and Jesus are there to comfort you no matter what you're going through. And that's why I'm always fascinated by the the pastoral world, because and I'm coming to this, April, I'll say later in life, but just how almost unconditional it is, and so real.
And
I do find it astounding.
yeah, and to have a community of faith that can help you during those times too, for me has been very, very
Mm,
significant. I mean, I received so many cards and email messages from people, some of whom actually I hadn't heard from uh, for 10 years or more, because we had, you know, lost touch over the years. And yet there was still
sure.
something there that people heard and wanted to respond. And that was very precious to me. There are a few people who I've met along the way who have grieved deeply different losses, and they graciously allowed me to share some of their story in my book. So it's not just my experience, but the experience of others too, which I'm so grateful for.
Oh no, that is that's a special sharing to be able to capture that. As we kind of go through this, it prompts me kind of thinking about, you. We often hear now of this loneliness epidemic, and um, I've in talking to some pastors, they said it's very evident even in the pastoral world of this loneliness. But how is that like in 25 years of your kind of world there? Have you seen shifts, like as far as what, like, be it I mean, I was thinking the other day how it's probably 30 years how our world has shifted so enormously. We don't really read newspapers anymore as paper. All our music is not on records or vinyl anymore. We basically stream it all. It came up the other day. Nobody plays road hockey anymore. Um, how have you seen that in the pastoral climes? Is how in a social manner we've shifted with, and some of it I would say are technical advances. But have you seen like are you able to articulate some of that in what you've been able to see? Because you see that in so many different ways with a congregation of people, right? Like you see us in a way that often we don't want to be seen because we have this image of who we are, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. I mean,
Mm,
I've read some about the loneliness epidemic of our present day, and a lot of that resonates with me because I have seen that also in ministry. I don't know that it is more now. Maybe some of the sources are somewhat different. Like, as you say, so much technology, and rather than getting together, sometimes people are um, on their phone, or even if they are together, they're on their phone somehow.
right.
And some of that can help build connection, yet I think some of that does increase that sense of being alone. Um, Early on, I remember reading a book, The Christian Secret to a Happy Life, written, I don't know, last century, a couple centuries ago. It's like an older book, but
Interesting.
she writes a letter to a friend who's experiencing loneliness. And she says, the loneliness you speak of is not solved really by other people, being single or married, having lots of people
Mhm.
around you or not. But there is a root loneliness that comes from our loneliness for God. And that's, where she wanted to direct her friend's attention. And I sometimes think about that because, as much as I think it's important to be connected with other people, or to join a small group in your church, or to be regular at Sunday morning worship, I mean, those are opportunities to connect with other people, but sometimes they don't really
Sure.
relieve that loneliness we might feel
Mm,
inside. And so, can we think of loneliness also as not only a social problem, but a spiritual
mm.
need, a spiritual call, then, to be closer to God?
Well, it's funny you say that because it kind of touches where I'm kind of headed with this a little bit because um, that has been like the pandemic probably demonstrated it more than anything. But how much we and the church helps to give a place, as you said, but how much we need each other. And in my world, switching from the corporate world and engineering into this writing world, I was very aware that I needed people in the sense that because in the corporate structure, you're meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting. You are actually the other side. You want time on your own, and you crave it actually just to get to think for a moment. But then switching into the kind of solitary part of a writer, which you've gone through a lot, um, it became very aware of this need to see or talk to other people. When we moved out to Abbotsford about 5 years ago from Ontario, it became very evident because now you're almost being encouraged not to go anywhere so that you avoid getting sick, as an example. And I began to do this thing because we didn't know anyone here either, is to go out for coffee with people because I said, I am I'm blown away by how much we need each other. Like I just it's like and technology doesn't help this very much because it's actually encouraging us to be alone with lots of activity around us, but no human connection. How have you seen that? Like, do you see like that's to me, I talk often about the church in this way because of that community, but I don't think it's the only thing. How do you see that?
Well, just thinking about the pandemic experience, one of the things that I did deliberately during that time would be to be out in my garden. And where my garden
Mm,
is in my townhouse complex, it's a place where a lot of people are passing by. So I would often just chat with neighbors, um,
there you
you
go.
know, not deep conversations about anything, but the weather, what's happening in the world, how the garden is doing, how is their garden doing, those kinds of simple conversations. But I think that also helps to build a sense of community. So I would say
Hmm.
even as neighbors, though we don't visit back and forth with coffee necessarily or have that kind of relationship, there is a sense of community together being in the same place. And so I appreciated that, and I was more deliberate about being out in my garden and saying hello to
Hmm.
people than I am perhaps now, because it's a different situation. I mean, I still do that, but I don't say every day, okay, I need to get out in the garden.
Right. And that it was when you mentioned the garden, like a morning walk would be something I would do, and just even saying hello to people, just like strangers. It was just one of those, like, because often we'll pass one another and we won't say a word. And here's this another human being that is a miracle in themselves for existing, and we just will gawk at the Cybertruck that drives by us, right? As this advanced technology that we've created as humans, so to speak. But this human being passing us, this remarkable piece of God's work, we just pass by. And it's like, I kind of like, well, hello works, and it instantly often will put a smile on a person's face. And I began to see, you mentioned the word community. I just I was not aware, April, of how much we need it. Like, I think that was the stunning revelation for me.
Yeah, and there's something about not being able to do that that heightens that reminds
Oh,
us. And maybe that's one of the lessons of the pandemic.
no, no question about that. So I'm going to turn this a little bit around back to your books a little bit, and that's saying, so I don't know that I got the count right, but I think you've written 7 books that are published. Is that right?
Well,
Or more?
that's the thing with
It's hard to.
writing. Sometimes you write and publish something, and then now it's no longer in print. So I have a few of my earlier books that are actually out of print, and the copyright then has returned to me. So I may be reissuing some of those, maybe as shorter ebooks or something like that. I haven't really decided. So yeah, I kind of lose track of that because I think, oh yeah, I published that. Oh yeah, no longer in print. So that's one of the casualties. But yeah, 3 books with Herald Press, Sacred
Hmm.
Causes, Spiritual Practices, and I just heard my doorbell ring, but hopefully it's just a package coming or something like that. But yeah, so Sacred Pauses, and then 4 Gifts, which is on
Yes.
healthy self care, and then Hope Beyond Our Sorrows. So 3 with Herald Press, which is a publishing arm of the Mennonite Church, both in Canada and the US. And then I have a few books of sermons with CSS Publishing. So that's primarily my books.
So, and of course, we always ask another author so is there another book that's in your mind?
Well, yes and no. So as I was reading and doing some research for Hope Beyond Our Sorrows, I kept coming across uh, comments about time and also comments about aging. And I've had a lifelong
Mm,
interest in time, how we use time. Why does time seem to go so fast when you're absorbed in a writing project, and at other times, time seems to go slowly? What is the best use of our time? Things like that. And and I guess I've also been hearing comments from people about time related to aging. And I've read some different blogs, and here's someone who is 40 bemoaning getting older. And I think,
oh,
well, wait a couple more decades, right? There is more to come. And
right.
I visited at Christmas with an older friend from our church who turned 100 on Christmas Day.
Oh,
Still follows the news
amazing.
every day, still reads. I'm updating our church directory, and I said to her, I'm inviting people also to have their photo and a little brief description and a scripture verse. So we encourage one another. So I wondered whether she had a scripture verse that I could include. And she said she chooses a new scripture verse every year.
Oh,
And
wow.
she told me, she said it was too early for her to have one for 2026, but she told me the one for 2025. And I thought, isn't that wonderful? And it made me
Oh,
think about time and aging again, because often I hear people speak of aging as if there is this decline. And
hmm,
yes, certainly people experience decline with health issues and, um, the physicality that goes with aging.
right.
Yet at the same time, I see in her and in others who are older, there is also a deepening. There is a growth. And
Oh,
why
oh,
is it that
yes.
at some point when we speak so positively about the 5-year-old growing up, at some point in their life, we think of them as declining because they're aging. We don't think,
Yes.
oh, you're you're 40, you're still growing. You're 70, you're 100, and you're still growing. And yet that, I think, is a real testimony to me, and it helps me to think about time in a new way. So I don't know if this would turn into a book, but I'm fascinated about time and growth and how we can keep deepening and growing our whole lives.
Well, it's funny that you bring this up because I don't like the word retirement. Because I think it gives us a fall, like everybody's striving for this retirement thing, right? You hear this often. I'm finally retired. And I'm kind of going like, so we spent our 35 years working hard, often at doing things we don't even want to do, to this retirement to do what? And it's kind of to your point, is that there's a deepening that goes on. And I'm experiencing this myself. And I'm in particularly around, I'll say the Bible and I'll say Christian history and things that are associated. Because I mean, the Bible was written, um, well, let's say 2,000 years ago, if we go with the New Testament and so on. And there's a lot that's happened. And I'm kind of at a point where like I can't get enough. Like I just can't get enough. Like of just learning, whatever it be. Bible study last night, a new thing kind of came up around Nicaea 325 and the um, the Arian controversy. And I'd never like even heard of this, and just totally fascinated by it. And there's a deepening sense because I'm finding that AI is giving us like information that would take often hours to get any other way from the world we come with, from the library with the cards that you'd go and look in the aisle to find the book you were looking for. And I think you're really onto something with this because there is something that's missing. And we're living longer, it appears, than ever. As you mentioned, Christmas Day, 100 years old. My parents are literally both in their 90s. Our grandson was born, he had 7 great grandparents of 8. And so when you say that about it, I'm very like I think there's a lot there because a lot's becoming and becoming available to us like no other like time. So it's there's a deepening there that it'd be interesting to spend some time. What is that? Like I often think of our minds as infinite, right? Like what can we actually accomplish? No, we can't go out anymore at 60 and play tackle football as an example. But our mind by and large is still very active. Like you were saying about where did the thought even come from around inspiration in your book? So that idea of a book, April, to me is a very fascinating thought. Wow.
Well, one of the things that we haven't talked about actually is another piece of my writing is that I'm the editor of Rejoice magazine. It's a daily devotional,
Oh,
and
good
I
point.
wrote for them for years and then was suddenly invited to take the role as editor. So I'm editing that, and I love it, working with writers and setting the themes and shepherding each issue through the publishing process and all of that. And someone said to me, "Well, when you left pastoral ministry, I thought you retired." And you're preaching once a month and you're editing this magazine and you're doing all these things. Aren't you going to retire? And I said, "Well, I hope I'm going to be writing at 85 like Margaret Atwood."
Absolutely.
And now
Like,
I wonder about that, because of course health and strength, and who
sure.
knows, I may not live that long, right? So we don't know what is ahead of us, but I
No.
think there is something about continuing to use our gifts in
Mm.
ways that God is calling us, and also to be able to encourage those who are coming after us. And that's why I'm also serving as a spiritual formation mentor with Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, and I am doing some teaching. Mennonite Church Canada has a transitions into ministry program for those who are new
Oh,
to
wow.
pastoral ministry and new chaplains. And so I have been invited to teach 2 sessions for that group coming up in the spring. So,
Oh,
those
wow.
kinds of things, I think those who have more experience, rather than thinking about now it's time to ride off into the sunset, are
I
there ways that we can continue to use the gifts and energy that God has given us, whatever that is, and
yeah.
also to think about those who are coming after us, and can we invest somehow in them as well?
It's a that's a big one to me, in being able to kind of understand that because it's kind of like you're at a point where, I mean, just 25 years of pastoral ministry alone has as an experience that is there's so much there, right? Like you to draw from and to be able to say like, is there something more that can be given back to the world that we're leaving behind us, as an example. I didn't realize that you were part of this magazine though, and does that not take a lot of your time?
It's also a part-time job, and the previous editor, who had been
Yes.
there for I think maybe 7 years, she needed to find a full-time job, and so she had said to the press that she was needing to move on, and so they invited me to consider it on the strength of, I have 1 year experience as an editor on another small publication. And other than that, I've written for them for
Hmm.
years. So for me, it was again, a huge learning curve how to move from being a writer to an editor. And I love it. Work with a wonderful team. We are
Oh, cool.
dispersed staff. So I'm here in British Columbia, and the copy editor that I'm working with right now lives on the other side of Canada, and then
Like
the
Nova
proof,
Scotia.
uh, no, on Ontario, I think, and
Oh, okay, okay.
the proofreader and the designer, like they're in the U.S., so it's very much being online as dispersed staff, but I do love that.
Interesting. And so, how do you find from moving from writer to editor and shifting back? I know when we're writing, like we're constantly editing. In fact, one line I used to say is, "It'd be great to write down a sentence once in a while that you once you finish it, you didn't feel like you had to go back and edit it." And it just continues to go on to me, like you just constantly trying to get that sentence right. How do you find balancing those two?
I've come across a few sort of interesting definitions of what it means to be an editor. So, one early
Ah.
definition that I read was, well, an editor is primarily a nag, nagging writers to get their manuscripts in on
Work
time,
done.
and nagging them about revisions and about copyright permissions and those types of things. And then I read another one which I love, that the role of an editor is to help writers shine. And so that's
Hmm.
what I hope for. I mean,
Yeah.
many of the writers for Rejoice are coming from uh, other other walks of life. So they may have a missionary background or a pastoral background, and they're writers, but they're not necessarily thinking of themselves as vocationally a writer, even though they write, devotionals regularly for Rejoice. And I think, yeah, they are bringing a unique experience, a unique voice and perspective to this. And so my role as editor isn't to, smooth everything out so it all sounds the same, but to help
Right,
make it
right.
shine. And yet, at the same time, there are copy editing and style standards that need to be consistent from the publication's point of view. So, yeah, to put that all together, and I sometimes think it's a very, in its way, a pastoral role to
Oh,
be
yes.
writing
Oh, yeah.
with others who are working together for the ministry of Rejoice magazine, which we hope and pray will bring some encouragement, some education, some new perspective to people who are reading it on a daily basis.
You know, when you say that, April, like, I think that's more needed than ever today. Like, getting those views that are outside of our insular mind, so to speak. Like for like, well, the title of your book is Hope Beyond Our Sorrows, but just for that hope. I mean, it doesn't take you very long to sit on your phone and just think the world's going in a bad way and forget like God's got this, right?
Well, and one of the exciting things for me in this last year has been working with students. So, one of our Rejoice
Mm.
writers teaches a writing class at a college, and she said, "What do you think if she would make an assignment to write for Rejoice, just one devotional, and have some of the students then have devotionals in Rejoice magazine?" So I was thrilled to be able to do that too.
No, no, that's very cool. So now you've mentioned Rejoice magazine along with a new book. Um, do you know what's next for for April?
Well, one of the things I'm working on for myself is because, well, as you know, since you've got your finger in multiple different things as well, um,
Yes.
one of my friends who is a musician, she said, well, we sometimes talk about having a portfolio. She says, so this is your portfolio of different things. But I said, yeah, sometimes it doesn't feel like a portfolio. It just feels like random things. And I'm needing to think of them as more centered. Um, Not just a
Okay.
series of random things in my day, but part of a kaleidoscope that's got some order and structure and center to it. So um, my word of the year, which I have chosen for a different word each year for a number of years, is centered. And then
Okay.
inspired by my 100-year-old friend, I thought, well, I should choose a scripture verse to go with that. And in the
Okay.
voice translation of the Bible, it has a verse from the Psalms, which is, "Blessed are those whose hope is centered on the eternal, their God." And I thought that is perfect
Oh
because
wow.
that's what I long for in all of these different areas of ministry and areas of my personal life, to have that sense of being centered on God. And so that for me is kind of what's
Mhm.
next this year, is to think about how all of these different things are centered. And my
Oh, that's
musician friend
cool.
said, well, she says, it is all centered. She says, because it's all about writing and people. And I thought, well, how wonderful for someone on, kind of the outside of it can look in and say, yeah, yes, it
See
is
that.
centered. And for me to sense that and to think of it that way, centered on the eternal my God, and how all of these things fit together.
You know, when you say that, April, I can't help but think of I'm a big fan of I don't think that's even proper terminology of Sermon on the Mount. And in Matthew 6:33, where he says, "Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." I can't help but paraphrase, like think of that as what you just said in the eternal sense, right? It's kind of amazing on that side. So, we've added magazine. You've got a new book. You've got a book signing coming up at Seven Oaks here in Abbotsford on April 18th. We'll definitely say that. Your new book, Hope Beyond Our Sorrows. For those listening, if you haven't heard April enough about this, you can learn a little bit more about her experiences from that book. No doubt you'll want to. Um, what else was I going to say to you? And it's funny how sometimes things just go into my mind and then they just leave just as quickly. But have is there anything, April, that you'd like to say that we haven't talked about today? Because I would have liked to talk a little bit more about, I'll call it Bible study. We're doing this Know Your God. And it's from I think it's Bishopsgate, St. Helens Bishopsgate in the UK, and it's like a 29-week going through all of the Bible. Obviously, you can't read all that in that kind of time frame, which has been very fascinating for me because it's coincided with believe it or not, a CBC course that we attend Northview, the Central Abbotsford campus, and they have a couple of programs with CBC, and one of them is this History of Christianity course. And you might even know Ian Proven. He was he was at Regent too. I know that, and so he's been fascinating to kind of look at. So we haven't kind of gone down that road anymore, but and we could still do that. But is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you would like to say in kind of what what we've talked about so far?
Well, there's so much, but I don't know how many hours or days we want to be having this conversation, Doug. But it's great to talk
Well,
with you. And your mention of biblical teaching reminds me that this last fall I taught for Canadian Mennonite University and their online program, and it was on the Book of Ruth, which
mm,
I've taught for that program before, but they said, this time we're looking for something that would be more of a Bible study, and it's just a 6 week short course. So I said, well, the Book of Ruth, that's a book that I have done a lot of work on already, and it's a book that would easily fit into a short form like the 6 weeks. And one of the amazing things in that course was that people by and large said they kind of knew the story of Ruth, but they had never heard a sermon on the book of Ruth. And I look back at my own records and I realized that in 25 years of preaching at Emmanuel, I never had a sermon on the book of Ruth either. So it was a
really?
delight to
Okay.
be able to look at that book carefully and discover some of the treasures in it. And in another year, this is long range planning, the Ottawa School of Theology and Spirituality, which also does online courses out of Ottawa, but they have students from everywhere
Oh
since
wow.
it's online. I will be teaching for them a book on dreams in the Bible. And I've previously taught it for Canadian Mennonite University, and I've taught it on my own, and now I'll be teaching it for them. And it's very much focused on dreams in Scripture. How are we to understand those dreams, and how do we understand our own dreams today, both the dreams that we have when we're sleeping and the dreams
Oh
or
wow.
the cherished aspirations we have when we're awake. So that also has been a fascinating study, and I'm looking forward to teaching it again. And that will be in February, March 2027. That's how far in advance this school of spirituality and theology is planning.
Wow. I went to school in Ottawa, like
Ah, did you?
to Carleton. And so because I my background's engineering, so that's we spent 4 years in Ottawa. But I'm fascinated by that course in the sense of, because we talk about dreams a lot. And it's when you say that, when you speak of dreams, are these like, I'll say, Ezekiel's, I'll say, I would have said vision, not dream, about seeing like the 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 wheels with eyes and the four heads. Like, is that the kind of dream that you take a look at in the Bible?
That's not one that I look closely at, but it is a vision, as you say. And in the Bible, dream and vision, those two words are kind of used interchangeably. So
Mm.
I think that's why I thought, oh, yeah, for this course, it would be good to talk about those dreams that we have when we're asleep and also the dreams or the visions we have for life when we're awake, because there is some mixing of that as scripture looks at dreams. And then some of the dreams that happen when people are asleep. So there are dreams in the nativity story as Joseph hears in a dream that yes, he should take Mary as his wife, and yes, he should come back. And the Magi, they have a dream about how they should go another way. So there are significant dreams in the Bible and also visions. So yeah, I'm looking forward to teaching it again. It's a 5-week course, 2 hours
Wow.
for each week. And if people are interested in that, you can always subscribe to my blog at aprilyamasaki.com because I do share what's happening through there as well.
Yeah, I was going to say we have to mention your website, and it will definitely go up on the description for the episode that we're doing as well. Because you put pretty much everything up on your website, do you not? Like all the things that are
Yes,
kind of hyping?
I went through a redesign this last year so that it could kind of be the hub where you can find everything. So sometimes I think, yeah, there's the writing, there's the editing, there's the teaching, there's the speaking, but there needs to be a central place where people, if they're interested, can find things.
Hmm. No, no, that is. I don't remember seeing being editor of Rejoice on there this time when I looked the last time. So you caught me on that one.
I might have to double check on
I
that, make sure it's there.
Oh, I'm sure it is. I was going to say because like all your stuff it appeared to be there, and it's like so. I yeah, I things keep popping in my head. So with all this that you've got going on, April, like how do you fit a message in once a month at 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 your church? Like it's can you just draw from all these different things to create that? Like how does that, because you're not one, I don't think that, well, you've already said you basically you write your whole sermon message out and take it with you. Um where does that fit in?
It fits in here and there. It's because I generally have my dates far like a few months in
Mm.
advance. So that helps me because I'm already thinking about things, even though I'm not deliberately working on it. And with Valley Crossway, they are very much lectionary based. So I also know the scripture text that will be for that designated Sunday. And
Oh,
I
okay.
have the freedom to choose which Sundays and which scripture text. So that also helps me because I can draw on things that I've worked on before, which is helpful. Um, the other thing I'm doing that's part of that, which just started in this last year, is that Valley Crossway has a whole liturgy that is printed out. So when my husband and I were looking for a church, where might we go after I had resigned? And I really wanted to find a church where I would have some opportunity to speak and where I might be able to have some kind of resident author partnership. And that kind of developed over time. But we went to Valley Crossway and we walked in, we got a bulletin sized handout, but it was a booklet. It was like, I think it was almost 30 pages. And
Oh,
that was
oh
all
wow.
the liturgy, the prayers, the scripture reading, not the sermon, but the music. It was all there. And I thought, this is a church that loves words. So it was a wonderful chance to get to know that community and then become resident author there and including speaking once a month. But in the last year, I've also been helping to do the liturgies. And that for me has
Okay.
been a wonderful synergy between speaking on one of those scriptures, or sometimes all four, bringing them together and then preparing the call to worship and the confession and the other parts of the service that go along with it. And because those are printed in advance, that also has a few weeks lead time. And so I'm already thinking about those scriptures and the theme as I'm preparing the liturgy. And then I usually put together the sermon closer to that particular Sunday. So this Sunday that I'm speaking, I also have worked on the liturgy, but that was turned in last week already. So when I come to
Okay.
the sermon, I
Wow.
already have all of that background. So that's kind of how it fits in.
So I'm thinking here a little bit because once I'd heard Jerry Seinfeld interviewed, and he said he thinks about things that are funny 24/7 all the time. He says, but it's got to be funny. And he says, I look at funny things all life. And the person who was interviewing said, that sounds like it would be absolutely exhausting. And he says it's one of the biggest gifts in life. And when you say what you're going through, it sounds like it's on that 24/7 as well, looking for things, like you said, words. You mentioned liturgy many times, but looking for those things for all the other things you're working on, from the magazine to books to your sermons. Is that kind of how it falls together for you in some ways?
I guess because so much of my speaking and writing and teaching is related to the real life that I'm living. So it comes out of
Mm.
that. Yeah, I don't know that it's that I'm exactly looking for things. I don't think I am. It's more as I'm working with scripture for a particular Sunday morning message, then I'm also thinking about what's happening in life. And it's not all about writing and ministry by any means. I have, time to have long phone calls with my sisters and with friends and go for walks and have coffee and do many other
That's
things
cool.
as well.
Well, it's part of that flourishing, if you like the word that I think of that brings it all together. April, what are you reading these days?
Well, it's kind of funny because I have not been doing much reading, especially reading of
Mm.
fiction. But last year, I had heard that Louise Penny, the Canadian
Yes,
mystery
yes.
novelist,
Hmm.
she had canceled her launch of her new book in the US and was just doing it in Canada instead. And so a friend of mine said she had decided she should read Louise Penny. She's never read any of her novels, and neither have I. And so she looked up the first one, Still Life, and she checked out the library. She said she would have been 172nd in line for that book. So she bought a copy. And then she said to me, she started reading it one afternoon and she stayed up until 2 in the morning reading that
She
book.
couldn't put it down. Oh, wow.
So I said, well, I was thinking the same thing. I've never read her, and I used to read, mysteries back when I read
Hmm.
fiction. And so she lent her copy to me, and I read it, and it's such a beautifully written book. And I did not stay up till 2 in the morning. I read it over a number of days, but I read that, and since then I have read two other Louise
Oh,
Penny
wow.
novels. I just finished the one that she wrote coming out of the pandemic, and I'm not
Okay.
necessarily reading them in order, of course, because she wrote, I think, 30 novels, so I'm a little
It's a
picking and
crazy number.
choosing. And then I read another one, The Kingdom of the Blind, and it was the first book that she wrote after the death of her husband. And she says in her acknowledgments, she wondered if she would keep writing this same series of books because he had been so much a part of it. And she said, how could I write this when I can barely get out of bed? And I thought,
Mm.
yeah, I resonate with what she said about her process in writing that book. So yeah,
Wow.
I've just finished now three Louise Penny novels in a matter of months, and I thought, well, maybe I'll just go to the library and see what's in and get another one.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Louise Penny because this just came up with a conversation I had the beginning of the week. And a gentleman was saying, have you ever read Louise Penny? And I'm going, I'm a Canadian, but I have not. He says, well, you're missing out. And you're just confirming that. How interesting. Do you get inspiration from not only books but from like movies? Like do you get that from other kinds of form of media?
Yeah, my husband was a real movie buff, collected
Okay.
DVDs and also used movies a lot in his teaching. So I've watched a lot of movies over the years too, and have gotten some inspiration from them as well. And the same thing with other forms of popular culture, whether
Hmm.
it's a podcast or a video or something like that. I think. Um, so much. There's so many ideas and such a
Oh,
breadth coming from all over. I mean, you mentioned AI, and really, I don't have any experience directly with using AI, but I think there's so much in the way of technology that can contribute to not just our practical lives, how we live that out, but how we understand ourselves and the church and ministry. And I know some people say one of the things that AI is bringing to the fore is what does it mean to be human? And I think
mhm,
really when we think about the biblical call of God to love God and to love our neighbors
mhm.
as ourselves, um, how does AI do that? Well, it's not an AI thing. That's a real human thing.
But well, when you mentioned the AI part, to me, I sometimes wonder whether that will help bring us back to those two things. Our loving God with all our heart and mind and loving our neighbor better. Primarily because it will, and I only had started to think about this a little bit because of AI's effect on education, which I'll get to in a second. But I'm just finding like I can find out so much information so very quickly that previously took enormous amounts of time to kind of research and undercover. You still have to check and you have to like, we've been through the other research world, so we know we have to go through the checks. We can't just take it. But when I mentioned education the other day, someone brought up this is like, you have that. Our generation has that. But when you're a teenager now, you don't have that. So if you can go to AI and get, well, like the example I always use is compare Ray Bradbury and Kurt Vonnegut's styles in a 1,000-word essay. That would be an assignment that I would detest, by the way, April, because it's not creating anything, but it's something. And he says, but now you can ask AI to do that for you and do nothing and just hand it in. And I said, I get what you're saying now. Like how do we deal with that in education? Because the idea of curriculum is going to shift in many ways, I think, because we can find out almost anything we want from our phone, like almost instantly from a factual perspective. And when you go to the education world, I sometimes wonder whether, and this is completely opposite to how I looked at it growing up, because I saw the social aspects of school, unlike my brother, um, a waste of time. You were there for curriculum and to learn facts, right? Hence the engineering world. I've now completely reversed that because I think where do you learn your social skills if it's not at school? And will education eventually become that in that format versus so curriculum oriented? I'm interested in your comment on that because it's like one of the things that kind of took me is saying like it is going to have gigantic impact on education.
Well, my immediate response as you shared that story was, what a loss if someone isn't actually doing the reading of these works
Oh,
rather than just relying on AI to compare things. And um,
yep.
you probably better read those things, make sure the AI is even right, because right now there's although
Oh
there are
yeah.
advances, there are concerns with accuracy too and bias too. So how do we deal with all of that? So there are a lot of issues around that for sure.
Like there's a lot of that's why I say like for us using this, we already have those kind of checks in us, like that we're not going like whatever you kind of ask is like okay, that's not quite correct. I need to go and find this out. But when you don't have that, and it's like, well, I want to be a hockey player, but I still have to do my calculus in high school. But now I can get AI to do my calculus. Like I'm just thinking of that orientation in a way and how that will impact the education side because it's like it's a cheating and yet it's like going to be available or is available already.
Yeah, big
Lots of
questions,
food for
Doug.
thought.
Big questions around all of that.
Well, you're it's interesting because I'm going to guess someone that's going to sign up for the course out of Ottawa that you're putting together around dreams is there because they want to understand it. It's not just to get a credit so that they can get whatever degree or whatever. It's like, and that's a completely different way of looking at what you're like what you're learning. Like right now, I mentioned about the history of Christianity. Like I'm just literally glued to it because there's so much stuff to be able to understand how we like the history of the Nicene Creed and understanding how they were done through a historical lens. Um, I'm fascinated by. But I'll tell you, at 14, I wasn't super fascinated by that.
Well, see, that's what I mean about growing and learning throughout our lives. Sometimes we're not ready for some of those lessons.
Well, it is one of those the sayings when the student's ready, the teacher appears, and it's like even in your own life, the mentoring, like where we started from, like it's like the path. It's not that you don't. When I say this, some people say, "Well, I had to do work," and it's that's not the part of it. It's just how the pathway seemed to open in ways that you didn't anticipate at all. Like you're getting the call from CBC, thinking that it's for your husband, but they're asking you to come and be a teacher, a professor there. Like crazy stuff.
Absolutely. Well, and the journey will continue for me and for you and for all of your listeners. There's more to come.
Oh, tremendous. Listen, man, I gotta land this thing. I gotta land this thing April. Wow. Anyway, I can't thank you enough for participating. I'm so glad we got introduced. Um, before we get this, so your website is aprilyamasaki.com.
Yes, that's right.
So we'll put that in the brief. Your new book, which you're going to be doing a book signing on April 18th at Seven Oaks Mall here in Abbotsford. It's called Hope Beyond Our Sorrows. And it's a book you want to read now. If you want to hear April preach, you can see her once a month at Valley Crossway Church. And she's got that course in Ottawa at the February 2027, I think you said, right?
Yes, starts in February, ends in March, just 5 weeks.
Wow. That could be your person you're talking to may be interested in signing up for that one. And of course, Rejoice Magazine that you're the editor for now. So what am I missing, April? Is there anything that we haven't said or talked about that you would like to still kind of include?
I don't know if I have anything else at this point. Maybe we'll talk again sometime, Doug,
Oh,
but
I'd love to do that.
really
I'd love to
appreciated
do
being
that.
here.
I'm like I said, I'm so pleased that we got introduced. Thank you for sharing much of your story. I think for those listening today, I hope you've enjoyed this episode with April Yamasaki. She's Pastor April Yamasaki. It's been for me. It's just been a wonderful conversation. This is so much fun. So much fun. I do hope you come back for another episode, April. I think it'll be very much fun. I hope you'll come back and listen to. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Better Than Not with April, and I hope you come back. I hope you subscribe to my YouTube channel, Better Than Not. And for that, I think we'll say goodbye, April. If you could stay on for just a minute, it'd be great. Bye for now. we on? Good. Welcome to the Better Than Not podcast. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But when we at least do something, we know it's almost always better than not.